yesterday, couldn't find one.
I usually have one pair stored here.
James Michael said he'd be a couple minutes late.
To get his
What's that?
reducing the font as the
hearing on the budget to provide any more additional information and answer any questions about what will be coming forward as the mid-biennium budget adjustments and the budget resolution that accompanies it. For today's agenda, I just want to take a brief moment to introduce the topic, hand it over to Brandon, our fearless finance director, to provide more details. And then also Mickey Esposito from Transportation and Utilities is here to touch on a couple of other budget-related items that you won't necessarily see adjustments in the resolution now because the costs associated with them are not known at this time, but eventually will be part of a CIP amendment in the future, and we wanted to give you plenty of heads up about that as well. So let me first just say thank you. Thank you for being a part of the solution on our mid-biennium course corrections. I know from talking to all of you that fiscal stewardship of the city is really important, and really appreciated the ability to have conversations with you all about how to approach the challenges we face and how to come up with the solution we can live with. So I hope that we can continue to have this kind of collaborative process throughout the coming months and heading into the development of the new biennial budget, because it'll take all of us to make sure that we're serving the public with good guidance and thoughtfulness that represents the diverse views and perspectives of Lincoln. So thank you. And with that, I would like to ask Brandon to take over with he has a one-pager he's prepared, and this is where the glasses come in.
Got mine.
there's some very fine print on this, so.
Yeah. Not the ball.
My arms aren't long enough.
So you got one page before you for basically the highlights of kind of the budget in general, but also some of the proposed changes for the 18 through 20. So I'm going to walk through this, and if you have questions, please let me know, and I'll try to answer anything as I go along. So total budget for 1920 is proposed at $586.5 million. So when we talk about the total budget, that we're not only talking about the tax funds, but we're also talking about all the different utility type fee services, whether it's water, wastewater, solid waste, parking, golf, and then all the other revenues we get from state and federal. So those are pretty much dedicated dollars that are set aside for specific purposes. Probably what receives the most attention as we go through budget is kind of that middle column in the blue area of the tax funded budget for 1920. That's $214 million. So that's actually down 0.68% from the 1920 budget that was adopted by the City Council. And that reflects some of the changes that the mayor has discussed with this body in regards to proposed or recommended changes for 1920. As always, like to note, we have a AAA bond rating that was recently confirmed by Standard & Poor's in July of 2019. If you can read that text, basically it says, you know, there's a stable outlook for the city of Lincoln over the 2-year period. However, you know, the things that could potentially change that outlook, you know, they're looking for us to maintain strong budgetary flexibility and liquidity, along with other character or credit characteristics such as the economy and things like that. So that's kind of, you know, the total overview highlight. Going to where do my property tax dollars go? As a reminder, the school district is 61%, the city is 16%, the county is 13%, and then other represents 10%. Those are all the kind of other small taxing jurisdictions that show up on the tax bill. So if you had an average house in the city of Lincoln at $180,000, once you take that times the current tax rate, 0.31648, that would be about a $570 tax bill to the city of Lincoln. And that goes to support all the various services, police and fire, police and pension costs, library, parks, all the things that occur within our taxing funds. So why do we focus really on the taxing funds? Well, in one, it's the largest pool of funds together. And then it's also the largest discretionary funding for the city. So like we talked about earlier, there is a color of money. So, you know, if we receive motor fuel taxes, those are dedicated to streets. Water utility funds are dedicated to water utility improvements. So we have lots of different revenues, but a lot of them are dedicated toward one specific purpose. So the taxing funds provide the discretionary revenue for this body. So what do we pay for out of those funds? You can see the largest is public safety at 57%, so police and fire, and then a number of various services that are also dedicated toward public safety, like prosecution and law, 911 transfers that we give to the 911 fund. So it's kind of the all-in number for public safety, including pension benefits. Other is at 21%. So that other basically is going to, instead of budgeting employee benefits at the departmental level, they're placed in basically general fund unassigned. So that makes up a large portion of that 21%. And then in addition to that, we have transfers to other funds that are fee generated. So like 911, they receive money from the state to help operate that fund, but not enough. So there's a subsidy that comes out that's transferred from the general fund into the 911 fund. Same for other funds like the health fund or StarTran. So all the transfers come out of that other pot of money. Culture and recreation, 13%, that's gonna be library and parks. General government, that's 6%, that's gonna be finance, HR, law, city council, mayor's office, and then also social security benefits, that basically another employee type benefit, but that's put into another fund, so that's lumped in there. Transportation and utilities at 2%, so like I talked about earlier, other funds, so the majority of transportation and utilities is funded by other dedicated type revenue sources. So the ones that come out of the taxing funds basically go to support sidewalks, capital projects in the community, and then also stormwater staff. And then economic opportunity at 1%, and that provides for planning and urban development. Then we skip down to the section on the changes that are recommended for 1820. So you received a list earlier that had 1.1 million of departmental cuts. We had conditional transfers. That was part of the budget package last year. There was language included that if the total revenues for the general fund were met, that money could be transferred to streets. Since we're not meeting the total revenues, that money cannot be transferred based upon the language. So that's the 1.9 million there. Property tax of 1.8 million. So that is revenue that we had estimates basically for the 1920 valuations at the time that we were setting the budget. We kind of understood at the time that there would be a residential revaluation, so that was included into the forecast for 1920. So this is 1.8 million that was received in addition to what was originally estimated for the valuation increases. And then based off the recent voter approval for the stormwater bond and the subsequent council action to give me authority to go out and sell those bonds, we did go out into the market, sell those, and those ended up being about $703,000 a year to pay for those 9.9 million of improvements. So that's additional tax revenue that would be received to pay off those bonds over the next 20 years. Okay, there's been some discussion at this body about reserve levels and whether the adequacy of those. So reserves in general are, I'd say, for about 4 purposes. One, for temporarily decreased in revenues due to grant losses or federal grant losses, so we can make up for those. In addition, provide resources during recession or economic downturn. Provide resources for the settlement of judgments or claims, and to basically fund one-time capital type investments. So as we get judged by rating agencies, that's one of the key things that they look at is our liquidity and how much reserves we have on hand. You can see we're currently estimating reserves at about 57 million for 1819. That target level, which was set by City Council by resolution, was 20%. So we're above the reserve level, target reserve levels that the City Council has established for the next 2 fiscal years. And then moving to the box to the right, so kind of what are the budget rules for the city? These are really just some very high level key ones. For the biennial budget, it's got to be adopted by August 26th every year. That's set per the charter. Also per the charter, we can only appropriate 90% of the taxes levied. So there's always a 10% gap that we can't levy. And then amendments are allowed by state law for unforeseen circumstances. So really, these budget rules are governed by 3 areas. One is the state law, which is the Nebraska Budget Act. And then the second area is the city charter. And the key things, provisions there, probably the biennial budget, the 90% of taxes levied requirement, and then the August 26th adoption. And then city code, one thing that's highly appropriate to our current discussion is it has during the biennial budget process, the council shall meet after August 20th to set the tax rate for the second year by resolution. So even though we set a biennial budget, we're always coming back and tweaking that in the second year, because our first year are only estimates for valuation. So we're always coming back in the mid-biennium and doing some tweaks during that process. So I'm going to stop there. I covered a lot. I'm going to see if there's any questions. It's a pretty, very, very high level overview kind of the proposed budget and the process today.
Yes, Richard.
What was the percentage increase in the, I guess, the city's abstract value?
Yeah. Total valuation increase was about 7.37%. We budgeted a 4.49% increase. And that's driven through two things, really. One is, I'm sure you all are aware, this is the revaluation. But the second part of that is new construction. And this past year, we had about $497 million in new construction in the community. So it's probably about a third, close to a third is driven by growth, and the rest of the increase is driven by revaluation.
Was any of that 479 million, was it all taxable and money goes to all the subdivisions?
Yes, because what...
It wasn't, any of it was TIF, none of it was TIF.
No, because when the assessor office provides us information, they're splitting the TIF out of that number, and then they focus on what is new construction that's taxable.
That's being taxed.
Yeah.
And the mill levy will be what?
So the tax rate based off of the current, so we did a flat tax rate at 0.31648, which is what the rate was for the 18-19 level. And then added the stormwater bond, the $703,000 to pay for that. So that increased the tax rate by 0.00333. So that went from 0.31648 to 0.31981.
Do that again.
Yeah.
So the tax rate for 1920 would be 0.31981.
So there will be an increase, but it's for the stormwater.
Yes. Okay.
So you said the reserve was set, I'm sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
you said the reserve was set by the city council?
Yes.
Okay.
Long time ago.
At 20%, but we are currently at,
We're estimating about 35%. Yeah.
and
Okay.
that's even with using part of that to help bridge the deficit.
Yes, that's built into that estimate.
I have a question. You said 90% of the taxes, we can only appropriate 90% of taxes levied. Does the other 10% go into cash reserves?
It does, well, we still receive that money.
Right.
So it comes into the general fund, and then, you know, if we're meeting our, I guess, our total overall revenue expectations, you know, if there's a surplus, yes, that goes into cash reserves.
Okay.
If we have a deficit, then we're taking down the general fund reserves.
So you're saying there's 10% unaccounted for that's not budgeted? In taxes received?
So it's a requirement. Yes, that's a requirement by charter. Now, I can't tell you that we are going to receive 10% in addition every year, because one, the county treasurer charges a fee for collection of that, and then the second part of that is you always have delinquencies and taxes, so you're never going to receive 100% of what you levy.
Right.
So that kind of builds in, you know, an estimate for us based off of some type of delinquency rate.
It rolls over every year.
Yeah, but yeah, those taxes are going to get paid, but it's going to come in maybe in a year or 2 or 3 later as a prior year property tax.
Okay. Thank you.
So Brandon, I don't know if you can address this, or maybe it's a question for Mickey. I know that that was a conditional transfer if we had that additional 1.9 million based on projections in our sales tax revenue. Do you know, are there projects that had to be backed off of, or it's just ongoing?
Absolutely not.
What's that?
None of that money had been put into a budget or CIP plan. It was not considered available until we had a sense of whether or not revenue projections for the budget were made. And if anyone wants to speak to that.
Yeah, so the money doesn't come to us until that condition is actually met.
Okay.
So the primary purpose of the dollars is actually to fill a budget hole. If if it is, if we reach our projection, then the money can be released to our budget and we can start programming it.
And I suspect we have Mr. Kaufman to thank for that cautionary approach. Because, you know, obviously, we all want to make sure that we have adequate funding for streets, and at the time, there was no awareness or sure guarantee that the sales tax quarter-cent ballot initiative would go forward or be approved. So, you know, we were under much desperate circumstances at that point to try to find ways to support streets, but there was, I think, a good fiscal conservative management of the budget process, and recognize that some of the numbers were aggressive, and that, you know, for the first time, delinquent property tax dollars were budgeted. Rather than letting those to come in and later in future years using those to fund expenses, they were utilized to put together this 2-year budget. So what would have normally been even more of a buffer does not exist anymore in this budget. And that's, you know, for transparency, that's important, but it's also, the trade-off is that we don't have that kind of cushion that in previous budgets had. If you want to ask more about that, I'll point you to Mr. Kaufman.
What's our plan for compliance with LB 103?
Good. So LB 103 was passed by the legislature in this past year. Basically, in my mind, it was a requirement to officially hold a second hearing on the budget. And the good news is we have done that consistently throughout our history of adopting the budget. So, you know, we are still going to hold that second hearing. There's more requirements that we have to publish, and we plan to comply with that, publish those items, and then that hearing is typically always occurred when we set the tax rate. So, you know, you'll consider the adoption of the budget on August 26th, and then you'll come back in September, and that's when we'll hold the public hearing to comply with LB 103. We'll publish all the requirements in addition to what was already published before, and then hold that public hearing in September, and then, you know, this body can consider officially adopting and setting the taxes levy.
Yes.
Do we do any adjustments to the CIP in the
There,
biennial?
yes, and there's some adjustments that I think Mickey's going to be
Mickey's
talking
gonna
about
talk
here pretty
about
quick.
those, okay.
Yeah. If not, I can continue kind of walking through this.
Yeah.
Okay. Just give you kind of an overview, tax fund revenues. So once again, we have 6 funds: the general fund, library, Social Security, police and fire pension, unemployment compensation, and bond and interest that pays for all the voter-approved bonds that the city has issued. Now, if you look at those, you can see sales tax is the largest at 37%. That actually all gets deposited into the general fund. So sales tax makes up about 45% of the general fund revenues. So that's the most economically sensitive tax that we have. And so the general fund is subject to the variations of that tax as it comes in. Property tax is about, that's split between, that's at 31%, that's split between all 6 funds. The general fund gets about 2/3 of that, and then the rest goes to fund the libraries, police and fire pension, unemployment compensation, Social Security. Then we have occupation taxes that are deposited into the general fund. You can see those are about 4%. They've been declining on an annual basis. And those are for telephone companies, cable companies. So as people utilize those types of services less, we receive less revenues. Return on equity for LES, that's about 4%. That goes into the general fund. We see about 2% growth there per year. And then motor vehicle, which is the property tax that you pay on cars, which is different than the wheel tax, which is different than motor fuel tax. That gets deposited into the general fund, so it's one of the core revenues for the general fund. And then you see that other of 21%. Those are just the various other things that are collected, whether it's library fines and fees for not turning your books in on time, or if you go to a swimming pool, so the charges for services. That 21% though also includes investment earnings for the police and fire pension fund that we have budgeted as well.
Quick
So-
question, has the motor vehicle tax been going up, down? Is it steady?
It's been going up on an annual basis. We've seen good growth there over the last 5 years.
Consistent?
Yeah, we've consistently seen
Okay.
growth. Yeah. Okay, if there's no more questions on that, then we move over to the restricted funds. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible because this can get complex. So restricted funds are a revenue cap law in the state of Nebraska. We are capped at collecting revenue for our key revenues at 2.5% a year. The city council, by a majority vote of a supermajority vote of 6 of 7 of its members, can increase that by an additional 1% to allow those revenues to grow 3.5% per year. So those restricted funds make up our core revenues for our taxing funds. So, that's property tax valuation, sales tax, motor vehicle taxes, and then in addition, state revenues like motor fuel tax are considered a restricted fund. However, that doesn't get deposited in the general fund, but it's still, if we receive more from the state, that kind of offsets this calculation a little. Okay. So it's good that we've seen growth over the last 5 years. Property valuations have grown 6%. Sales tax has grown 3.3%. We've only allowed for a 2.5% growth as the council hasn't adopted that additional 1%. So that's why we've been seeing downward trends on our restricted funds calculation. In addition, as we grow, that money comes from new growth in the community. That continues to put pressure on service levels as there's more areas to cover the city. So this growth helps to fund not only current but also potential expanded services. Personnel is the largest expenditure that we have in our taxing funds at about 64%. So there are things that are going to push up our personnel costs that are out of our control, like comparability. So our personnel costs have, I think, grown on average about 3.7% over the last 10 years. So as our expenditures continue to grow, but we're restricted on revenues, at some point, this balance that we have is going to be exhausted. And that's probably the biggest looming fiscal crisis that you might have. Because once those are exhausted, we will automatically have to decrease our revenues. So that's going to put pressure primarily on our expenditures and primarily on personnel. So we need that 1% additional just to account for the growth that naturally occurs in our expenditure base and to address community service needs. If we don't, I think at some point moving forward, it's not going to be next year or the year after that, but we are going to have a point where we are reaching a crisis where we are going to have reduction in force, or you're going to have public vote on this restricted funds law, which it's hard for me to sit here and explain that to you. I'm not sure how we can explain that to the public. So this in the end, it gives this body in the mayor's office future financial flexibility. It doesn't mean an automatic increase in the tax rate. This body sets the tax rate on an annual basis and sets the approved expenditures on a biennial basis with tweaks in the middle. So in the end, I think it's in the best interest of this body to vote for the 1% to allow for future financial flexibility.
Brendan, what do you think is the biggest misperception about this restricted lids raising it that 1%? That we're gonna go out and just spend it, right?
Well, and that's this additional 1% will give future financial flexibility. But if your revenues continue to grow above that 2.5%, or if they're going above 3.5%, at some point in the future, you're going to be limited. And the only way to get around that is through some legislative solution or having a public vote.
Any questions?
How much did our revenues grow this year? Or are you estimating?
Well, for the
restrict-
taxing funds, it's a decrease based off our sales tax estimates.
Based off the estimates.
Yeah.
What increase are we having this year on our revenue, percentage-wise? Is it above 2.5%?
I have to go back and look at that. I can get you that information. I think right now we're estimating sales tax for 1920 to grow about 2%.
Okay.
And then I'll have to go back and look at property tax rate or increases.
I think for all of us who are concerned about keeping pace with growth, this is sort of a very important topic for making sure that we can. We won't be able to hire new emergency responders or take care of the growing needs of the city if at a certain point we are having to reduce personnel who get that work done for us. This is routinely approved in other jurisdictions, and Omaha's lid authority vastly exceeds its budget. I don't know if you have those stats with you or not.
They've
but-
got over 60 million kind of balance that's reserved, so they've continually approved that additional 1%.
as do most municipalities across Nebraska, including our county board.
And RTSD.
So we
Does
are,
the 1% need to be approved every biennium or every fiscal year?
So, yeah,
Once a
1 year at a time.
1 year at a time.
Because basically every biennium we get, or mid-biennium, we get new valuations. So this body has to go through and set a new tax rate. So once we receive these, we have to go back and revise that calculation and submit that to the auditor's office.
But a vote in favor of the 1% flexibility does not raise the tax rate.
No.
When was the last time the city of Lincoln voted for the 1%?
it's been a while, it's been a couple of years.
Can
But
we
we-
estimate in geologic time how long
But
it's
we,
been?
by not voting for it over multiple years, we've compounded the problem that we face in terms of bumping up against the lid. And we are truly an outlier compared to other cities in Nebraska in having not passed that on a regular basis.
There's a fairly complex calculation, but in the end, you have this base number that you want to grow. And the only way to grow that is by 2.5%. That's automatic. You can get additional 1%. If there's new construction in your community above 2.5%, which is a really high threshold, then you can capture. So let's say you had 3% growth, you could capture 0.5% and then add that to your base. So that's rarely occurred. I think we've had a little bit over the last 2 years, but it's pretty rare. So you have to grow the base, and if you don't grow the base, then you run out of these balances, which restricts your revenue growth to 2.5%.
look that way.
You- 0809 was the last time the 1% was voted for.
Thank you.
10 years.
Okay.
Okay.
And
Oh, I
then
don't know.
12 and 13, but wasn't that a misunderstanding because I think they went with the supermajority of those in attendance voting?
Yep.
Instead of an actual supermajority?
Actual supermajority of the total number of city council members.
Well, just to be clear, it's 75% of the body is what I believe the requirement
those
is.
present.
Of those present.
I think there was Attorney General opinion last year that stated it was of the governing body present. So that 1213 number, when there were only 6 there, but 5 voted for it, we were in compliance with that based on the Attorney General opinion.
So it was not rescinded in any,
No.
okay.
No.
But just for relative context, as our Director of Transportation Utilities has shared, road construction costs tend to go up by an inflation factor of 5% a year. So, you get to start to see the disconnect between sort of
Those
growth in some of our
construction
expenses.
costs, is that capital improvements?
It's both, yeah,
So they can be outside of the 2.5%?
very much so.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Capital improvement can be outside? of the-
Well, but if you remember, so restricted funds are motor fuel tax, which we did some shifts last year in the budget to shift more capital improvements to motor fuel tax. But the majority of those funds are paid for outside of, they're paid by the wheel tax. And so there's not as much capital improvements in the taxing funds, which is an exemption allowed for this calculation along with like bond and interest. But those are relatively minor expenditures compared to, basically we're paying for personnel within our general fund and our other taxing funds. Real quick, just update on sales tax numbers.
Yeah.
You got it? Okay.
Got it.
So the good thing, if you look at these over the last 3 months, you've definitely seen some improvements. So based off of where we had projected about 3 months ago, we're a little bit above that. So we had growth. If you look on page 4 at the net, and you go down to the bottom right corner, you can see we had growth of 2.28%. So that compounds moving into the future. Now, given that we're still short of budget, we're hoping that we see trends for this online. We had 1 month of great sales tax return the first month. We had one that is tough to tell because refunds have been lower. So that's the other thing that's hard to tell is it because our refunds have been lower this year that we're paying out for incentives to businesses, or is there an impact because of online sales tax? So
Now, those refunds are part of the state economic development plan, is that
yes,
right?
yeah,
And that comes to conclusion unless they pass something new, right?
yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So we dropped, I think, somewhere about 600,000. So we're trending about 1.2 million a year, and then that dropped by about half this past year. With that, if there's no further questions, I think Nikki, you wanted to address you.
We'll hand it over to Transportation Utilities to talk about some budget-related matters. Oh, you want to join?
Yeah, I'll just sit right here. Oh, Brandon's not staying, huh?
Brandon's leaving as fast as he can.
Brandon, run.
Yeah. Also, I just wanted to acknowledge I have Donna Garden here with me. She can answer any questions you have about water projects specifically, but we wanted to touch base with you on just the historic winter that we had and the weather events as a result of that historic winter, and talk a little bit about the budget impacts that we've experienced. So what you have in front of you is a fact sheet associated with our status update to you on Lincoln Water System after the flood, and where we are. First of all, we're just extremely proud that even during the flood and up until this time, water quality was always maintained. We couldn't be more proud of our crews who preserved water quality throughout that incredible event, and just continue to have incredible pride for them. Water supply, as you know, was our issue, but currently we are producing at least 92 MGD per day. Peak demand this summer has ranged around 70 MGD, million gallons per day. So we're sitting really well, and we have water in our reservoirs as well. So we have plenty of capacity to meet demand, and even with summer months, we've been doing okay. With respect to the damage and the required repairs, we do have currently 5 wells that are not operating at this time. One, a vertical well in our north well field, was actually needs to be rebuilt. It sort of fell over during the flooding event itself, so it is gone and needs to be completely reconstructed. A transmission main that served that particular well also serves another 3 wells. There's sort of a cluster, if you will, on that same transmission main. Because we didn't want any risk of cross-contamination when we lost that original well, we went ahead and shut all of that transmission main down. And so those 3 wells are not currently operating either. So that cluster is not operating. That's a total of 4 wells in the North Well field at this time. Our one horizontal well on the island, and you recall the Black Hawk, the images of the Black Hawk dropping sandbags down on the well called 90-1. We had significant land loss during that flood, and so we have a lot of land restoration to do and some flood protection to take to make that system a little bit more robust. The real issue there is power and the feed to that particular well. So aside from doing a lot of debris cleanup and land restoration in that area, we really need to make a more robust power connection to that horizontal well that provides a lot of water. It's about 10 MGD in and of itself, so it's a really important structure. We do have an alternative feed to our north well field now. That's currently in place, but we need to construct a main feed for our north well field. But again, you saw the video with washouts. We just have a lot of land restoration to make. It's exposing transmission mains. It's exposing wells underground. We just need to be able to fix those problems and issues. A lot of debris cleanup as a result, and putting some roads back together. And so what you'll see in this budget, this biennium, is a request to authorize us to spend the dollars we need to make these repairs. In the 18-19 budget, we were operating on the City Council's emergency order, and we will need about $1.8 million. We need you to amend the budget to authorize us to spend $1.8 million on emergency repairs in 18-19. We will keep that that mandate that council passed in place, if with your approval, obviously. And then in 19-20, what we would ask is that you amend the CIP to allow us to expend up to $15 million for those large capital improvements that I described over the next several months. We hope to have all of those repairs completed by spring of 2020. So that's what we are asking of you, that you approve the 1.8 in 18-19, and again, the up to 15 million in 19-20. The good news, if there's any good news, is that a lot of those costs are actually reimbursable. We do have contingency to cash flow those items. There is money in the bank, in the water fund. However, we are going through a very robust FEMA process to obtain reimbursement from FEMA. They reimburse up to 75% of the cost for flood repair. In addition, NEMA, the state counterpart of FEMA, reimburses an additional 12.5%. So we're doing pretty good. In addition to that, we do have city insurance that we are working with our our insurance company and risk management to facilitate and coordinate with those reimbursements. We think that as a total, our repair costs shouldn't exceed 15 million, but that's what we're targeting for the total. Yes, sir.
What amount does the city have to pay before our insurance policy kicks in and starts paying?
Oh, is anybody from risk here, what the deductible is? Yeah, I apologize. I don't know that, but I will find that out.
But Mickey, does the 1.8 in 2018, 2019, does that represent our 20% contribution or something to that effect that will match the FEMA and NEMA?
No, actually, it's reimbursement. It's a reimbursement protocol. So we have to front the dollars first and be subject to reimbursement. Those are the repair costs, the 1.8 in 1920, and then the up to 15 authorization is to be determined what those final costs are. But it's a cost figure, not the net of what we would do after reimbursement.
So
Right.
we pay the upfront, later they pay us.
Yeah.
Where does that money go? How is it accounted for when it comes back to us?
Well, it should go to the water fund. And usually there is not a council action, if you will, outside of a budget process to account for it. But we will obviously keep you notified when we
$1.8
receive
million
it.
is coming from the waterfront, and the water fund, and then be reimbursed to the water fund.
That's exactly right, yes.
And just to, I'm going to dig just a little bit. You said FEMA up to 70%?
75%
75%, and NEMA
reimbursable.
12.5.
Yes.
And then our insurance something after our deductible.
And self-pay is 12.5, right? So it's a.
Okay, and 12, thank you.
So a local share, a state share, and a federal share. The local share includes our insurance.
Okay.
And we'll have more for you on those updates as costs come in. We'll be sure to brief you specifically.
James, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that when I met with your staff, when I went onto the wellfield, I was really, really impressed hearing their stories and watching the videos, because they did an excellent job keeping Lincoln safe. So thank you
Yes,
for that,
thank
and thank you to your
you.
staff for that. And
Thank you. Yeah,
this
and Donna
would-
too. She's
Yeah.
a great leader.
Thank you so much for keeping us safe. And I think that this would have been worse if we didn't have the skilled, competent staff that you have.
Thank you.
So I think you did a great job. I think everyone did a great job. And I just wanted that to be noted, that thank you for everything you did during this crisis, and to Donna and your entire staff.
Thank you, Councilman. We are hoping to bring them to you for a Mayor's Award of Excellence, some of the heroic efforts we really want to talk with you about. It was really incredible what some of them did. So thank you for that. Okay, yes?
Yeah, I want to ditto those remarks too, because we know that some municipalities in Iowa and in
Yeah.
Nebraska are still struggling to get their water systems up and running. But now, did you say, jumping back, are there 4 wells that are currently operational in the North well field? Is that correct, or do I have the numbers wrong?
Yes, so we have 4 wells in the north well field that are not operational.
That are not?
Yes.
Not operational.
One is actually just gone, and that one needs to be fully built out, but the other 3 are tied to that transmission main, which is also out. The final 5th horizontal well, that's the big one that produces 10 MGD. That's on the island, and was the subject of the Black Hawk dropping sandbags to restore the land there. So 5 total wells.
So with the horizontal well field, have they restored the road? Because it seemed like that was
Yeah.
a big part of it. They were trying to reconstruct a road to get to that.
Yes,
horizontal well.
yes, and we have full access to it. In fact, we were able to get out there with Mayor and Senator Fisher recently, and it was, the levels were low, and it was actually a beautiful day, and so it was quite a relief to see. Yeah.
But the devastation was.
Yeah, the debris is
stunning.
everywhere.
Uprooted trees. It used to be surrounded by greenery and trees, so kind of a land buffer. It's gone.
Land loss is really devastating. So you see exposed footprints of those large wells and the trees being downed. It's pretty incredible. We'd invite any of you to come out and see it. We'd love to host that.
And in order to restore some of that land, do you actually have to go through permitting with the Corps of Engineers?
Oh, yeah, there's emergency operations, and I think Don is nodding back here. There are sort of contingencies and emergencies in place, but yes, we have to get required permits, and it can be a process, but.
Yes, it can.
It can be tricky, but they are doing an amazing job lifting. I mean, just like Councilman Bowers was sharing, they're just a dedicated group of people who just get the job done. Okay, I'll go into the next issue unless there's more water.
Yeah, real quick.
Sure.
The 1.8 million that has been spent at this point?
Yeah, so we were operating on a council action to do the repairs. It
came out of
included,
the
yeah,
water
that
fund?
came out of the flood event itself.
But is that, could that be used for the 12.5% that we would need to put in as a matching?
Oh, yes, certainly. It can be part of the 12.5, and we'll subtract out the insurance, certainly, yeah.
So you're
But we hope
budgeting the
that
whole amount?
most of it is
Not knowing
reimbursable.
what we're going to get in
Right.
rebates or...
Right, yeah, and it takes many years. I just want to put a healthy expectation out there. The FEMA process, the NEMA process is extensive. It can be years long, so.
Would you like it to take?
Are we, and then also, are we working with Omaha? Does Omaha have some of these problems, or OPPD? They supply the power?
OPPD does supply the power, and in fact, we are working with them on a number of hazard mitigation grants. So in addition to repair and submitting for reimbursement, we are looking at more mitigation and reliability, and looking at grant procedures and processes and submitting NOIs with OPPD. So we're
And they're-
trying to be very proactive.
And they're asking for FEMA funds and NEMA
Sure,
funds also?
yes, yeah.
And so
a
is
lot of people.
MUD?
MUD is working with us specifically more on that interconnect
Okay.
dialogue, which is another whole topic for another day.
Agreed.
Just to clarify process,
Yeah.
could you explain, you've got the authorization for up to 15 million, but as the actual costs come in, you'll come back to council to update the CIP to reflect those actual costs?
Okay.
Right, so we are asking you for an amendment to the CIP to authorize, give us your blessing for an up to $15 million expenditure. And as we have actual expenditures, we will bring those forward to you. They're not for approval, we would just brief you on actuals. So what we're asking in the CIP, we have an estimate of cost to fully restore the well field to its pre-flood condition, and it would take the 1.8, which for the most part we've spent this year, and then the up to 15 million for next year. Asking for your permission to make expenditures of funds we have, and amending the CIP to reflect that.
In order to repair.
You need to, in order to repair.
Okay.
Repair only.
That amendment is actually reflected in the budget resolution, so that's one thing that you would be considering as we go through on August 26th.
So you'll see it in your legislative
You want to vote
action.
separate on it?
It's not a separate vote, it's in the whole resolution of
Okay.
amendments to the budget.
You can
Mid-biennium.
split it if you wanted to.
Okay.
Yeah, that's your, you can have that done if you'd like.
There's a lot of detail that we're not covering today in the resolution, so if you're going through that resolution and if you have questions, please contact us and we'll go through anything that you're looking through, so.
Great.
Okay, one more item. I just need
No.
to bring to your attention.
No, it's
Let's talk
80
about the other fiasco we had last year. As you recall, we had 21 open events with snow. We usually respond to about half of that each year. Our snow budget is in our operating, not our capital budget, but in our operating budget, and it is usually around $4 million annually. And what we wanted to let you know is, after calculating everything, we are at about a $2 million budget deficit relative to our snow response. We're sitting at $6.1 million for that grand total. It includes personnel services, contractual services, materials and supplies, all which increased, and I can get you information as you need it. So the question is, what do we do? And what I'm proposing to, what I've proposed to the mayor, what I'm proposing to all of you, is that because it is contained in our operating budget, and we do have a 2-year budget, I would like to take a wait-and-see approach where we see what kind of winter we have this year. Again, in 1920, we will have another $4 million. We have been in positions of actually having $1 million or more savings in past years where we've had a mild winter. But ahead of the 2020 budget process, we'd actually like to see how we do this winter. If we get into a situation where we need to come back and make an adjustment and talk about it again, then we might have to look at more dramatic types of arrangements. Maybe it's projects, maybe it's some other operating type of budget savings. Maybe it's talking about contingency. But we wanted to make sure before we head into next year's budget that we gave you a heads up about the historic winter that we had, and that we're running just a little north of $2 million in deficit in that budget. I don't know if Mayor wanted to.
That's good news.
Okay, yeah. There's no action needed today on your, or in the budget on your part.
Do you have a forecast? I mean, I realize forecasting is it's magic, but do you have a forecast for what the winter weather is supposed to be like this year?
Farmer's Almanac out yet?
Yeah. What does the Farmer's Almanac say?
I wish I did. But based on the last, based on the last 10,
It's gonna snow.
Okay.
based on the last 10 years I've been in this position, boy, we've never run into this problem. We've always had an ability to save money during weather events. It was just extraordinary, and our hope is that we can course correct with a mild winter, but we will see how it goes.
Thank you.
All right.
You have the same amount budgeted for snow?
We
this year?
do, and it's just, there's a little uptick, but around 4 million.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, like Brandon mentioned, if you have any questions at all about what's in the resolution, or if any second, other thoughts that occur to you after this meeting's over, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us help in any way we can.
And then the one, do you want me to hand? Oh, if I could just, I won't speak about this, but I'll just hand that out for you on the paratransit services if you have any.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's just a proactive measure. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate seeing you and all the explanations. That's terrific.
Thank you.